The moment Pauline Donnelly stepped through the heavy oak doors of the little church on the edge of Caldwell, Kansas, she had no idea that the quiet man who had come to sit beside her in her darkest hour would become the very reason she found cause to smile again. It was the autumn of 1878, and the town of Caldwell sat like a dust-colored jewel on the Kansas Indian Territory border, a place where cattle drives rumbled through like slow thunder and men made fortunes or lost their souls in equal measure. The Santa Fe Railroad had only recently pushed its iron fingers into the region, and with it came all the restless ambition and roughness that characterized a frontier town still finding its footing between lawlessness and civilization. Saloons stood shoulder to shoulder with mercantile shops, the smell of livestock drifted on the perpetual prairie wind, and the little white church at the north end of Main Street served as something of a quiet anchor for those who needed one. Pauline had arrived in Caldwell 3 months prior, accompanying her husband, Gerald Donnelly, a land surveyor from St. Louis who had accepted a contract to map the surrounding territories for the railroad company. Gerald had been a decent man, the sort who paid his debts and tipped his hat and never raised his voice unreasonably. He was not a passionate man, nor a particularly tender one, but Pauline had believed that steadiness was enough. She had been wrong about many things in her 24 years, but that belief in steadiness had perhaps been the most costly. Gerald Donnelly had died 6 weeks after their arrival in Caldwell, thrown from a horse he had borrowed from the livery stable on a morning when a rattlesnake spooked the animal near the creek bed south of town. He had not suffered long, the doctor had assured her, and Pauline was not certain whether she was meant to take comfort in that or not. What she knew was that she was now a widow in a frontier town where she knew almost no one, with a modest amount of savings that would keep her comfortable for perhaps 4 months, and absolutely no idea what to do next. The women of Caldwell had been kind in the immediate aftermath. Mrs. Hattie Brewer, who ran the boarding house where Pauline rented a room, had brought her soup every evening for 2 weeks without being asked. The Reverend Caleb Morrow and his wife, Adelaide, had called on her regularly, offering prayers and gentle conversation. A few of the wives of the more established ranchers and merchants had left baked goods at her door with little notes of sympathy tucked underneath the cloth coverings. But grief is not a wound that heals in 2 weeks, and by the time the sympathy calls grew less frequent and the baked goods stopped arriving, Pauline found herself confronting the full, raw weight of her situation in solitude. She was not devastated by love lost if she was entirely honest with herself, and that very honesty was its own particular torment. She wept not only for Gerald, but for the life she had imagined, for the security she had counted on, for the children she had thought she might have someday in the not-too-distant future. She wept for the fact that she was 24 years old and completely alone in a dusty Kansas town where the wind never seemed to stop blowing. On the evening of October the 14th, 1878, with a cold front moving in from the north and the last amber light of autumn pressing thin and pale through the windows of her boarding house room, Pauline reached a kind of breaking point. She had been sitting with a letter from her mother in St. Louis urging her to come home, and she had read it 4 times without being able to decide anything at all. The letter sat in her lap like a small accusation. She put on her coat, wrapped a wool shawl around her shoulders, and walked up the empty street to the church. She did not go there expecting Reverend Morrow to be present. She did not go there with any particular plan. She went because the church was quiet, and because the Lord's house had always been a place where she felt that whatever she was carrying might somehow be lighter, even if only for a short while. She pulled open the heavy oak door and stepped inside into the warm, still air that smelled of candle wax and old wood, and the faint sweetness of whatever wildflowers someone had placed in a tin vase near the altar last Sunday. The church was empty. The evening light came through the plain glass windows in long, dusty columns, and the wooden pews gleamed softly in that half-darkness. Pauline walked up the center aisle, sat down in the 3rd pew from the front, and pressed her hands together in her lap. She lasted approximately 30 seconds before the tears came. They came quietly at first, the way a river rises before a flood, just a trembling of the chin and a burning behind the eyes. And then they came in earnest, the kind of weeping that is not entirely about one thing but is instead the accumulated weight of every hard thing pressing out through the only opening it can find. She wept for Gerald, and she wept for her loneliness, and she wept for the mother's letter in her coat pocket, and she wept for the fact that the wind outside was turning cold, and she did not know how she was going to face whatever came next. She did not hear the church door open behind her. Emmett Thatcher had been riding since before dawn. He was a cowboy by trade and by nature, 28 years old, with a face that had been seasoned by sun and wind into something honest and quiet and not unpleasant to look at. He worked cattle for the Diamond H Ranch, one of the larger operations west of Caldwell, and he had been in town that evening to settle accounts at the feed store and retrieve a repaired saddle from the leather worker on 2nd Street. He had meant to head back to the ranch before full dark, but his horse had thrown a shoe on the edge of town, and he had spent the better part of an hour at the blacksmith's, and now it was too late and too cold to make the full ride back with any sensible comfort. He would stay the night at the boarding house, he had decided, and ride back in the morning. He had stopped into the church not for any dramatic spiritual reason, but simply because it was the nearest building to where he had tied his horse after the blacksmith's, and the wind had picked up considerably, and the temperature was dropping fast, and he needed a moment out of the cold to regroup his thoughts and decide how he wanted to spend the evening before heading to the boarding house. He had opened the door and stepped in quietly, the way a man does when he enters a space he knows is meant for quiet, and he had immediately seen the woman in the third pew. She was turned slightly away from him, her dark hair falling loose from its pins at the back of her neck, her shoulders moving with the unmistakable rhythm of someone crying. Not softly, crying in the particular, honest way that people do when they believe themselves to be completely alone. Emmett stood at the back of the church for a moment. The easiest thing would have been to back out quietly, to leave her to her privacy and find another building to warm himself in. He almost did it. His hand was still on the door. But there was something about the quality of her weeping that struck him in a deep place, something that spoke not just of ordinary sadness, but of a profound and bone-deep exhaustion with grief, and he found that he could not bring himself to walk away from it entirely. He also did not want to intrude, so he did what seemed to him the only reasonable middle thing. He walked up the aisle quietly, his boots soft on the wooden floor, and he sat down in the pew directly beside Pauline Donnelly. Not in the pew behind her, which might have felt like hovering. Not at the very far end of the same pew, which might have felt like deliberate distance. Right beside her, close enough that she could feel she was not alone, far enough that she had room to breathe. Pauline startled. She looked up sharply, her eyes red and wet, and for one horrified moment she thought she might die of embarrassment. A man she had never seen before was sitting beside her in the church, a tall, lean cowboy with a hat he had removed and was now holding in both hands on his knees. He was looking straight ahead at the altar, not at her. His jaw was set in a way that was not unkind but simply steady. He did not look at her. He did not speak. She waited for him to say something. He said nothing. She thought he might apologize for intruding, or ask if she was all right, or introduce himself, or do any of the dozen things that politeness seemed to call for. He did none of them. He simply sat there beside her with his hat in his hands and his eyes on the altar, utterly calm, utterly present, utterly silent. Something about that silence was so completely unexpected that for a moment Pauline's tears actually stopped. She looked at him again, this profile of a man she did not know, and she thought that she had never in her life had someone sit beside her in her grief without immediately trying to fix it or explain it or rush her through it. Every person who had come to comfort her since Gerald died had said words, many words, well-meaning words that nonetheless had the effect of making her feel that her grief was an inconvenience that needed to be managed rather than a thing that needed simply to be felt. This man had sat beside her and said absolutely nothing, and was asking absolutely nothing of her, and somehow that was the most merciful thing anyone had done for her in 6 weeks. The tears came back. But something in them had shifted. They were slower now, less frantic. She pressed a handkerchief to her eyes and let them come at their own pace, and the man beside her sat still and quiet and did not move. They sat like that for a long time. The light in the church grew dimmer as the evening deepened outside. Somewhere down the street, a piano in one of the saloons began to play a tune, faint and tinny through the thick walls. The wind pressed against the windows. A candle on the altar burned low and flickered. When the last of it had passed, when the weeping had run its course and Pauline sat with only the quiet aftermath inside her, she exhaled a long, shuddering breath and pressed her hands flat on her knees. "I don't know you," she said. Her voice was rough from crying. "No, ma'am," the man said. His voice was low and even unhurried. "Why did you sit here?" He thought about that for a moment honestly, as though it deserved an honest answer. "Seemed like the right thing to do," he said finally. Pauline looked at him. In the dim light of the church, he was a solid, unremarkable presence in the way that a well-built fence post is unremarkable. There was nothing showy about him. His coat was worn at the elbows, and his hat had seen better days, and his hands on the brim were calloused and brown from outdoor work. He had dark eyes, she could see that much, and they were still directed at the altar. "Emmett Thatcher," he said before she could ask. "I ride for Diamond H west of town." "Pauline Donnelly," she said. "I am, or was, recently arrived from St. Louis." She paused. "My husband died 6 weeks ago." "I'm sorry," he said, and unlike every other person who had said those words to her in the past 6 weeks, he did not follow them with anything. He did not elaborate or explain or offer comfort. He just said he was sorry and let the words sit there and be what they were. "I don't know what I'm going to do," she admitted, and she was somewhat astonished to hear herself say it, because she had not said it aloud to anyone, not even to herself, not in those exact words. He nodded slowly. "That's a hard place to be. I have a letter from my mother asking me to come home to St. Louis." She reached into her coat pocket and held it without opening it, as though the weight of it was the thing she was describing rather than the words inside. "But I don't know if going back is the right thing either. I don't know what the right thing is." "What does your gut say?" She blinked at him. "I beg your pardon." He looked at her then for the first time, and she saw his eyes clearly, dark brown and steady, and carrying the particular quiet of a man who spent long hours alone in open country and had learned to be comfortable with his own company. "What does your gut say?" he repeated. "Not what your mother says, not what the sensible thing is. What does the inside of you say when you sit still enough to hear it?" Pauline opened her mouth to answer and then closed it again. She sat with the question. It was not the kind of question anyone had asked her. It was the kind of question that required honesty, and honesty with herself was something she had been avoiding with considerable skill for the past 6 weeks. "It says I'm not done here," she said at last, and she was surprised by the certainty of it. He nodded as though that settled something, and looked back at the altar. They sat for a while longer in silence, and it was a different kind of silence now, one that had room in it for both of them, easy and natural as the quiet between people who have known each other long enough to not need noise to fill the space. When Pauline finally rose to leave, Emmett rose with her and walked with her to the door. Outside, the night was cold and clear, and the stars were enormous above the flat Kansas prairie. They stood on the church steps, and she could see the few lights of Caldwell glowing down the street. "Thank you," she said, "for sitting with me." "It was no hardship," he said simply. "I don't suppose you'll be in town long if you ride for a ranch." "Just tonight," he said. "Horse through a shoe," she nodded. "Well, thank you, Mr. Thatcher." "Miss Donnelly," he said, and touched his hat and walked off down the street in the direction of the boarding house. Pauline watched him go, and for the first time in 6 weeks, The dark weight sitting on her chest felt, if not lifted, then at least marginally lighter. She returned to the boarding house and slept better than she had in longer than she could remember. In the morning, she came down to the communal breakfast table to find Emmett Thatcher already there, sitting with a cup of coffee and a plate of eggs, talking quietly to Hattie Brewer about the condition of the road south. He looked up when Pauline came in and gave her a brief nod of greeting, nothing more, and she nodded back and took her place at the table. Hattie, who missed nothing, looked between them with the barely contained curiosity of a woman who ran a boarding house and therefore considered human interaction something of her professional business. "You two acquainted?" she asked brightly. "We met at the church last evening," Pauline said. Hattie's eyebrows rose slightly, but she made no further comment, which for Hattie was a considerable act of restraint. Emmett finished his coffee, thanked Hattie for breakfast, put on his hat, and paused at the door. "I'll be passing back through town in about 2 weeks," he said, and Pauline was not entirely certain if he was speaking to Hattie or to her. "Need to pick up a supply order for the ranch." "Doors always open," Hattie said, which she said to everyone. Emmett looked at Pauline, then briefly direct. "Hope you find your footing, Miss Donnelly," he said. "Thank you," she said. "Safe traveling." He left, and the boarding house felt inexplicably somewhat quieter for his absence. Pauline spent the next 2 weeks thinking about what her gut had told her in the church, that she was not done here. It was a strange certainty for a woman with no particular ties to Caldwell and no particularly good reason to stay, and she turned it over in her mind like a smooth stone, examining it from different angles. She wrote back to her mother, gently, explaining that she was not yet ready to return to St. Louis. Her mother wrote back expressing concern and more than a little exasperation. Pauline filed the letter with the others and turned her attention to the practical question of her situation. She had, as it turned out, skills that were in demand. She had grown up in a household where her father's early death had required her mother to take in sewing and alterations, and Pauline had learned beside her. She was an excellent seamstress, accomplished enough to do the kind of fine work that a frontier town had difficulty sourcing. She also had a quick, organized mind and neat handwriting, having been educated at a church school in St. Louis until she was 18. It was Mrs. Adelaide Morrow, the Reverend's wife, who put the first idea in her head. "We are desperately in need of someone to run the Sunday school," Adelaide said one afternoon over tea. "The woman who did it before moved away with her husband in August, and the children have been without instruction ever since. I don't suppose you would consider it. It would not pay money, but it would give her a purpose and a connection to the community that she badly needed." She said yes immediately and felt the decision settle into her with a rightness she had not expected. The following week, a further opportunity presented itself when Mr. Amos Hartley, who ran the dry goods store, mentioned in Pauline's hearing that he was overwhelmed with his bookkeeping, and his regular clerk had broken his wrist. Pauline offered her services for a modest wage, and Amos, who was a practical man above all else, accepted on the spot. By the time 2 weeks had passed since her conversation with Emmett Thatcher in the church, Pauline Donnelly had the beginning of a life in Caldwell, Kansas. It was not the life she had planned. It was not the life she had imagined. But it was hers, and she was beginning to understand that there might be something to be said for that. She did not allow herself to think too much about the cowboy from Diamond H. He had been kind in the church, genuinely and remarkably kind, and she appreciated that with the full sincerity of a woman who understood what kindness cost. But cowboys who rode for outfits west of town were not, as a general rule, central figures in the lives of widows who worked at dry goods stores and taught Sunday school. Their worlds touched only briefly and then separated again, like two rivers that shared a moment of parallel running before diverging across different planes. And yet, when she was honest with herself, which she was increasingly making a practice of being, she thought about his voice, low and unhurried, and the steady quality of his presence beside her in the church, and the question he had asked her, "What does the inside of you say when you sit still enough to hear it?" and she thought that she had never met anyone quite like that. She was standing behind the counter at Hartley's Dry Goods on the afternoon he came back to town. She heard the bell above the door ring and looked up from the ledger she was working on to see Emmett Thatcher ducking through the doorway, which was slightly short for his height. He straightened and his eyes found hers immediately, and something in his expression shifted, a brief, genuine thing, gone in an instant as though he had not entirely expected to find her here. "Miss Donnelly," he said. "Mr. Thatcher," she said, "you mentioned you'd be back in town. Supply run for the ranch." He looked around at the shelves. "Did you decide to stay then?" "I did," she said. "I am working for Mr. Hartley 3 days a week, and I teach the Sunday school for Reverend Morrow." He nodded as though these facts satisfied him in some way. "Good," he said, and there was a warmth in that single syllable that made her feel, absurdly, like she had done something right. He placed his supply order, which was substantial, and while she was pulling items from the shelves and tallying the figures in the ledger, they talked. Not about anything of great importance. About the cattle season and the condition of the roads and the recent arrival of a new family from Ohio who had taken up a homestead claim 7 miles east. About the Sunday school children, 3 of whom Emmett apparently knew by name because their fathers worked cattle in the same general territory. About the particular quality of Kansas autumn, which was different from Missouri autumn, Pauline observed, brighter and colder and somehow more absolute in its beauty. When the order was filled and tallied and Emmett had paid, he stood at the counter a moment longer than strictly necessary. "There's a church social this Saturday," he said. "I'll be in town for it." Pauline looked at him. "Will you?" "Supply run takes most of 2 days," he said simply. "I'll be staying over." She understood that he was telling her something, though he was saying it in the most understated possible way, and she found to her own surprise that she was pleased. "I'll be at the social," she said. "I help Adelaide Morrow with the preparation." "Then I'll see you there," he said, and put on his hat and left. She stood for a moment looking at the door after it had closed behind him. Then she turned back to her ledger, and she was smiling without quite meaning to be. The church social on Saturday was held in the yard beside the church, because the autumn days were still warm enough in the afternoon to make outdoor gathering pleasant, though the evenings came cold. Adelaide Morrow and several of the women of the congregation had been preparing for 3 days, and the tables were loaded with pies and preserves and bread and roasted meats, and the particular sort of lavish abundance that frontier communities produced when they put their collective efforts together, as though the making of plenty was a celebration of survival. Pauline had spent the morning helping arrange tables and decorating the yard with late-season wildflowers in mason jars. She had put on her best remaining dress, a dark blue wool with white piping at the collar and cuffs, which she knew suited her dark hair and pale complexion rather well, and she had done her hair with more care than she had taken in weeks. She noticed herself doing these things and thought, with a small, private amusement, that she was doing them for a specific reason. Emmett arrived mid-afternoon, having apparently finished his supply business at a reasonable hour. He came into the churchyard with his hat in his hand, and Pauline saw him looking around in the particular way of someone who is looking for a specific face in a crowd, without wanting anyone to know that is what they are doing. She knew the look because she was doing the same thing from across the yard. Their eyes met, and he made his way to her through the crowd, stopping to tip his hat at Adelaide Morrow and shake hands briefly with Reverend Morrow and exchange a word or two with the cattle rancher Henry Briscoe, who apparently knew him from previous seasons. "Miss Donnelly," he said when he finally reached her. "Mr. Thatcher," she said, "you look considerably less wind-blown than the last time I saw you." The corner of his mouth curved upward. It was not a broad smile, she was beginning to understand, was not really a broad smile sort of man, but the understated version was somehow all the more genuine for its reserve. "2 nights in a real bed will do that," he said. They spent the afternoon in easy proximity, moving between conversations with others but always gravitating back toward each other, as though there were some quiet, invisible current running between them. Pauline introduced him to the women she had come to know: Mrs. Hattie Brewer and Adelaide Morrow, and the schoolteacher, Miss Clara Hinds, who was 22 and bright-eyed and decidedly curious about Emmett Thatcher. Emmett introduced Pauline to Henry Briscoe and the other ranchers and cowboys from the territory who had come into town for the occasion, men with sun-darkened faces and direct eyes who tipped their hats at her with genuine courtesy. As the afternoon shifted toward evening and the air began to turn cool, someone produced a fiddle and someone else produced a guitar, and the social took on a more musical character, the open space in the yard becoming a loose dance floor of tamped earth. "Do you dance, Mr. Thatcher?" Pauline asked. "Not well," he said, "but I'm willing to embarrass myself if you are." She laughed, and it was the first time in many weeks that she had laughed in the way that comes from genuine, uncalculated amusement, the kind that starts in the chest rather than in the performance of social grace. Emmett looked at her when she laughed, and whatever was in his expression was not something she could easily name, but it was warm and it was direct, and it made her cheeks feel warm in a way that had nothing to do with the bonfire someone had lit at the edge of the yard. They danced badly and cheerfully through one reel, then stepped off the floor and stood together near the fire, listening to the music and talking more freely than they had before. She learned that he had grown up in Texas, that he had been riding cattle since he was 16, that he had come to Kansas 3 years prior when the Diamond H had expanded its operations. He had a sister in San Antonio, he told her, who was married to a schoolteacher and had 2 small children, and he spoke of her with obvious affection. "You're close with your family?" she asked. "Close enough," he said, "though a man who moves cattle for a living doesn't see family as often as he should." He paused. "What about yours, besides the mother in St. Louis?" "A younger brother," she said, "Thomas. He's 20 and working at a newspaper in St. Louis. He wants to be a journalist." She smiled. "He writes me letters that are entirely too well composed for letters between siblings. He practices on me." "That's a good brother," Emmett said. "He is," she agreed. "He wrote and offered to come to Caldwell when Gerald died to help me settle things. I told him not to make the journey, that I was managing." She was quiet for a moment. "I was not entirely managing, but I did not want to be a burden." "You weren't managing because you shouldn't have had to manage it alone," Emmett said, and it was said so plainly, and with such complete absence of judgment that she felt the truth of it settle in her without the accompanying sting she had been expecting. "No," she admitted. "I suppose I wasn't." They stood by the fire as the night came fully down around the churchyard, and the stars appeared above in their multitudes, brilliant and cold, and impossibly numerous in the way that prairie skies allow. The music went on, slower now, a waltz that someone's fiddle was making a creditable attempt at, and the voices and laughter of the other people at the social formed a warm, human backdrop to their quiet conversation. "I'll be back in a month," Emmett said as the evening drew toward its close. "Supply run before winter might be one of the last easy trips before the roads get bad. Then I'll look for you in a month," she said. He looked at her steadily for a moment, and she looked back, and the fire crackled between them. "Miss Donnelly," he said. "Miss Donnelly is beginning to seem overly formal for a man who once sat beside me while I wept in a church," she said. Something moved in his expression that she thought might be a quiet kind of happiness. "Pauline," he said, and the way he said her name, quietly as though it were something he had been holding gently, made her breath catch in a way she had not expected. "Emmett," she said. He put on his hat and bid her good night and walked off into the Caldwell dark, and Pauline stood by the dying fire for a long moment, her hands wrapped around a cup of cooling cider, thinking about the particular warmth that a person's presence can leave behind it even after they have gone. The month that followed was, by any practical measure, a productive one for Pauline Donnelly. The Sunday school grew in attendance as word spread that the new teacher was engaging and patient, and had a gift for making scripture both accessible and interesting to children, who would far rather be outside. She had 12 regular students by the end of October, ranging in age from 5 to 14, and she had come to be genuinely fond of them. All of them with their serious small faces and their questions that were sometimes theological and sometimes entirely unrelated but always earnest. Her work at Hartley's Dry Goods had likewise expanded. Amos Hartley, who was sharp enough to recognize competence when it saved him money, had increased her hours and her wage and was beginning to consult her on his ordering practices, which she was organizing with considerably more efficiency than his previous system. She had also, on the recommendation of Adelaide Morrow, taken on 2 private sewing commissions, alterations and a new dress for Mrs. Briscoe, the rancher's wife, who was expecting a child in the spring and needed her wardrobe adjusted accordingly. She was building something. She could feel it taking shape around her, slowly and imperfectly, the way a building goes up from the ground, and she found that she was proud of it in a way that was new to her. She thought about Emmett often. She thought about the way he listened, wholly and without the restless quality of someone waiting for their turn to speak. She thought about the directness of his dark eyes and the economy of his speech, and the way he had asked her what the inside of her said when she was still enough to hear it, and the answer she had given him, that she was not done here, which had proved truer than she had known when she said it. She did not write to him, because they had no formal correspondence between them, and she would not have known how to initiate it without it seeming presumptuous. She simply waited for November and kept herself occupied, and tried not to count the days with too obvious an eagerness. He arrived on the 7th of November, 1878, on a morning when a thin skim of frost was melting off the wooden sidewalks of Main Street as the sun came up. Pauline was opening the front door of Hartley's when she saw him riding down the street on a solid gray horse, the supply wagon from the ranch behind him, driven by a young hand named Pete who couldn't have been more than 17. Emmett saw her at the same moment she saw him, and he turned the horse toward the hitching post in front of the store and swung down and took off his hat in one smooth motion. "You made it before the bad roads," she said. "Barely," he said. "There's a cold front moving in." She held the door open, and he came inside, and they spent the better part of the morning going through his supply list together, while Pete went about other errands in town. The conversation moved easily between practical matters and other things, the way conversations do between people who have found a natural frequency with each other. At noon, Hattie Brewer served lunch at the boarding house to any who came, as was her custom, and Emmett and Pauline walked down together and ate at the long communal table with several other boarders and a couple of traveling merchants who were passing through. Hattie's eyes noted their arrival side by side with an expression of quiet satisfaction that Pauline chose to ignore. After lunch, as the cold front that Emmett had predicted began to push gray clouds across the prairie sky, Emmett asked if she would walk with him. They walked south along the edge of town to where the buildings gave way to open grass, and the full immensity of the Kansas plain revealed itself, stretching away to the horizon under the heavy sky. The wind was cold and smelled of coming snow, and Pauline pulled her coat close and thought that this was one of the most beautiful and terrible landscapes she had ever seen, this absolute, uncompromising openness. "Do you love it?" she asked. "This country." He stood beside her looking out at the plain and was quiet for a moment. "I respect it," he said finally. "I'm not sure respect and love are different things out here. In St. Louis there was always something between you and the sky," she said. "Buildings, trees, other things. Here there's just everything all at once. Does that frighten you?" "It did," she said, "when I first came, but I think I'm beginning to understand it." She looked out at the wide, cold sky and the brown-gold grass bending in the wind, and she thought that there was something in this landscape that asked you to be honest in a way that crowded, sheltered places did not. There was nowhere to hide in it. You were either equal to it or you were not. "Emmett," she said. "Yes," he said. "I want to ask you something direct." He turned to look at her. The wind lifted a strand of her hair across her cheek and she pushed it back impatiently. "Do you intend to keep coming back to Caldwell?" she asked. "More than the supply runs require." He held her gaze without flinching. "That depends on whether you want me to," he said. "I am asking what you want," she said. A long moment passed, with just the wind and the vast sky and the cold smell of coming snow between them. "Yes," he said, "I intend to come back." "Good," she said quietly. "Is that good?" he asked, and there was a careful quality to the question that told her he was not taking anything for granted. "Yes," she said. "That is good." He looked at her for a moment longer in that steady, unhurried way of his, and then he reached out and took her hand where it hung at her side and held it, and did not let go, and they stood like that looking out at the prairie as the first few flakes of early snow began to drift down from the gray sky. The winter of 1878 into 1879 in Caldwell was not a mild one. The cold settled in hard by late November and stayed, and the cattle operations in the surrounding territory went into their winter reduced activity mode, which meant that Emmett was not needed for full-time ranch work during the deepest months. He negotiated with the Diamond H. foreman, a tough, fair man named Silas Cross, to take a room in Caldwell for the winter months, returning to the ranch for specific work as needed, but spending the majority of the cold season in town. He told himself this was practical, that the roads between town and the ranch were treacherous in heavy snow, and an extra set of hands in town was useful for the various wintertime tasks that a working frontier community required. He hired himself out for odd jobs, helping with fence repairs and wood splitting and loading freight, and was paid fairly for it, and this was all perfectly sensible and true. It was also true that the main reason he wanted to be in Caldwell that winter was Pauline Donnelly, and he was honest enough with himself to know it. What grew between them in those winter months was something that neither of them rushed, which made it all the more real. They had Sunday dinners together at the boarding house, the two of them and Hattie and whatever other boarders were present, and the conversation was good and easy and wide-ranging. They walked together when the weather allowed, which in a Kansas winter meant the cold, clear days between storms when the light on the snow was brilliant and sharp. They sat together at the Sunday services, which Pauline attended as a matter of both faith and community, and Emmett attended because she was there, and also because he found that he meant the prayers more than he had expected to. Adelaide Morrow noticed, of course, and approved vigorously and quietly in the way of women who understand that the most effective support for a fragile new thing is to give it room to grow without making too much of a fuss about it. Hattie Brewer noticed as well and was slightly less restrained, remarking one evening at supper that it was very nice to see people finding their way to happiness when they deserved it. Emmett had looked at his coffee cup during this observation, and Pauline had looked at her soup, and both of them had been rather red in the face. There were evenings when Emmett sat by the fire in the boarding house common room, and Pauline sat across from him with her sewing, and they talked or they were quiet in the particular easy way of two people who no longer need noise to fill the space between them. He told her about Texas and about the cattle drives he had been on, the long brutal rides up through the territory in the driving heat of summer, the violence of sudden storms on the open plain, the particular beauty of a dawn on the trail when the light came up over the grass in sheets of gold and rose. She told him about St. Louis and about her father, who had died when she was 12, and about her mother, who had survived that loss by becoming extremely practical, and about the life she had tried to build with Gerald Donnelly, which had been decent but had lacked something that she had not had a name for then but thought she might have a name for now. "What's the name for it?" Emmett asked, on an evening in December when the snow was heavy against the windows and the fire was good and warm. She set down her sewing needle and looked at him across the small distance of the room. "Being known," she said. "I wanted to be known by someone, really known, not just companionably understood." He looked at her, and in the firelight his eyes were very dark and very warm, and he said simply, "I know you." It was not a declaration exactly. It was something quieter and more certain than a declaration. It was the statement of a fact that had become true between them slowly and without announcement, the way most true things become true. "I know," she said, and her voice was soft. He got up from his chair and came and sat beside her on the settee, the way he had once come and sat beside her in the church, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, and they watched the fire together while the snow came down outside, and it was, she thought, the most content she had ever been in her entire life. He kissed her for the first time on a clear, cold afternoon in January, standing on the steps of the church after the Sunday service, while most of the congregation was still inside exchanging greetings, and the winter sun was making long shadows on the snow. It was not dramatic. It was not particularly planned. She had said something that made him laugh, one of the rare genuine laughs that were precious because they were not common, and when he looked back at her his eyes were alight with it, and she was laughing too, and the gap between them was very small, and he kissed her. It was brief and warm and tasted of the cold air and the coffee from breakfast and something underneath those things that was simply him. And when it was over she stood on the church step and looked up at him and thought that she had been wrong about steadiness. Steadiness was not wrong as a thing to want. She had been wrong about what real steadiness was. Gerald Donnelly had been steady the way a piece of furniture is steady. Emmett Thatcher was steady the way the ground itself is steady, the way the wide Kansas plain is steady, present and enduring and absolutely real. "I have been wanting to do that since November," he said. "Only since November," she said. "I think you should have done it sooner." He laughed again and kissed her again, and this time it was not brief. Reverend Morrow came out of the church at that moment, took in the situation with a practiced eye, and said, "Ah," in a tone that managed to combine surprise with deep satisfaction, and went back inside to tell his wife. The following weeks were a particular kind of happiness that Pauline had not known was available to her. It was not the dizzy, breathless happiness of stories, the kind that makes the world seem unreal. It was solid and warm and present, the kind that makes the world seem more real, that makes the particular quality of winter light through a frosted window more beautiful, that makes a shared meal or a shared joke or a shared silence feel like a small gift that is also enormous. They were careful with each other, in the way of two people who have both known loss and therefore understand that beautiful things are not permanent by default, but have to be tended. They were honest with each other because they had each, in different ways, discovered the cost of dishonesty with themselves and had no appetite for repeating the lesson. They were, in the particular quiet language of the frontier, good for each other, which was the highest compliment that practical people in hard country knew how to pay. In February, Emmett came to Pauline with something on his mind. She could see it in the way he was sitting at the supper table, present but slightly elsewhere, turning his coffee cup in his hands. "Tell me," she said. He looked at her. "Sela's Cross told me today that the Diamond H is planning to reduce its crew in the spring," he said. "The owner, Mr. Hargrove, is getting older and has been talking about selling the operation. There may not be a full crew job there by summer." She waited because she could see there was more. "I've been thinking about a piece of land," he said. "East of town, 7 miles. The Howard family is looking to sell their claim. They're going back east, the wife can't take the winters." He paused. "It's 160 acres. Decent water, good grass, modest house that needs work. Manageable price if a man has saved his wages over a few years and isn't too proud to negotiate hard." Pauline looked at him carefully. "Are you thinking of buying it?" "I'm thinking about whether it would be a reasonable thing to do," he said, in the careful way that people speak when what they are really talking about is not quite what they are saying. "Emmett," she said quietly. He set down his coffee cup and looked at her with that direct, unwavering quality she had come to love. "I am trying to ask you something," he said, without getting ahead of what is actually proper to ask at this point. "You are not ahead of anything," she said, and she could hear how steady her own voice was and marveled at it, because her heart was doing something decidedly unsteady inside her chest. He was quiet for a moment, collecting himself. This was, she understood, a man who had spent 3 years riding cattle and living in bunkhouses and keeping his own company, and asking for what he most wanted was not a thing he had much practice at. The courage it was taking him was visible, and she loved him for it. "I would like to build something here," he said. "Not alone." He met her eyes. "With you, if you're willing." The dining room of Hattie Brewer's boarding house was not, by any objective measure, the most romantic location in the world. It smelled of pot roast and the particular mustiness of heavy curtains in cold weather, and there was a clock on the mantel that ticked with unnecessary loudness, and somewhere upstairs, a traveling salesman was moving around his room in boots he had apparently not removed. But Pauline Donnelly sat across from Emmett Thatcher at the supper table and thought that she could not have imagined a more perfect moment than this one if she had planned it for a year. "Yes," she said, "I am willing." Something in him settled visibly, like a man who has been braced against wind that has now stopped. He reached across the table and took her hand. "I would like to do this properly," he said. "I would like to ask you to marry me. I will write to your mother. I know I'm not what she pictured, but I will be honest with her and I will respect her opinion even if she takes a while to come around to it." Pauline laughed softly. "My mother will come around," she said. "She is practical above all things, and she will recognize that you are good." "Then you'll say yes," he said. It was not quite a question. It was the careful placing of a fragile thing into the air between them. "I will say yes," she confirmed. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I love you," and it was said in the same way he said everything, without drama or performance, simply and truly and completely, and she felt it go all the way down to the center of her. "I love you," she said back. The clock on the mantel ticked. Upstairs, the salesman finally removed his boots. The fire in the grate crackled and settled. Hattie Brewer appeared in the doorway with dessert, looked at their joined hands and their faces, and said, "Well, it is about time," with a satisfaction so complete that it bordered on proprietary. They were married in the spring. The ceremony took place on the 15th of April, 1879, in the little white church at the north end of Main Street, the same church where Emmett had found Pauline weeping and sat beside her in the silence of that October evening. Reverend Morrow performed the service. Adelaide Morrow had arranged wildflowers in every mason jar she could find, and the church was fragrant and bright with early spring color, yellow and pale blue, and the first soft white blossoms from the one flowering tree in the church yard. Pauline's mother, Constance Donnelly, had come from St. Louis for the occasion. She was a trim, sharp-eyed woman of 50 who had, as Pauline had predicted, come around to Emmett after a series of formal letters that he had written with great care and no small effort. The letters had been honest about his circumstances, his prospects, his character, and his intentions, and Constance Donnelly, who was indeed practical above all things, had recognized in them exactly what Pauline had said she would recognize, that this man was good. Meeting him in person had settled the matter completely. Constance had spent 30 minutes in private conversation with Emmett on the morning before the wedding, during which she asked him questions of considerable directness, and he answered them without evasion. And when she came out of that conversation, she had patted Pauline's hand and said, "All right," which from Constance was the equivalent of a standing ovation. Pauline's brother Thomas had also come from St. Louis, having written 3 increasingly dramatic letters begging to be present, and his company was a particular joy. He was 20, bright and quick, and genuinely delighted by the frontier, and he spent most of his 2-week visit filling a notebook with observations about Caldwell that Pauline suspected would eventually appear in some publication. The Sunday school children had been allowed to attend the ceremony, and they sat in 2 rows near the back, with the concentrated solemnity of children who have been told that this is an important occasion, which occasionally cracked into whispered commentary that Adelaide Morrow suppressed with gentle efficiency. Selah's cross came from the Diamond H, and Henry Briscoe and his wife, and Amos Hartley, and a handful of other cowboys and ranchers and townspeople who had, over the winter and the early spring, come to understand Emmett and Pauline as simply being, in some fundamental way, together. Standing at the altar in her blue dress, which she had refashioned with new lace at the collar and cuffs, watching Emmett walk down the aisle toward her with his best hat in his hand and his eyes entirely on her, Pauline thought about the October evening when she had sat alone in this church and wept with the full weight of her grief and her uncertainty and her fear. She thought about the door opening and the quiet footsteps and the man who had sat beside her without a single word until she was ready. She had not known then that readiness, in this particular case, would mean this. Would mean him, and this church, and this spring morning, and this life that was beginning right now in the full presence of everyone they had come to love. Emmett reached the altar and stood beside her and looked at her, and she saw in his eyes exactly what she felt in her own chest, a calm and absolute happiness that was not the absence of everything hard, but was instead the steady, unshakable thing that exists within the life built by two people who chose each other with full knowledge of what choice costs. Reverend Morrow cleared his throat and opened his Bible. "Dearly beloved," he began, the Howard claim turned out to be everything Emmett had believed it to be. The house was modest and needed work, true enough, but the land was good, with a reliable creek running through the eastern quarter and a hillside pasture that would winter cattle reasonably well if properly managed. They moved in on the 1st of May, 1879, with a wagon loaded with the combined modest possessions of their former lives and the additional household goods that the women of the congregation had contributed in the frontier tradition of community wedding gifting. The first weeks in the new house were the kind of weeks that become stories later. The chimney drew badly until Emmett rebuilt the flashing. There was a family of raccoons in the root cellar that required an extended negotiation to evict. The well needed deepening. A section of fence on the north pasture had been left in poor repair by the Howards, and 3 of their 4 cows wandered through it on the second morning, which resulted in a very early and very eventful retrieval operation that Emmett and Pauline were both laughing about before they had finished it. She learned the rhythms of the land, the particular pace of a working homestead that is different from the pace of a town. She had the kitchen garden planted by June, and the first vegetables coming up by July. She continued her sewing work, taking on commissions as word spread that the best needlework in the Caldwell territory was available at the Thatcher place, and this income supplemented what they earned from cattle and gave her the particular satisfaction of a skill that was economically valuable as well as personally gratifying. She stopped teaching the Sunday school when the distance from the homestead to town made the weekly trip impractical, and that was a genuine grief. But she wrote careful notes for her replacement, a young woman named Betty Garrison who had just arrived in Caldwell with her family, and she and Betty corresponded by letter throughout that first summer, and Pauline was proud when Betty's first reports of her classes sounded more confident than her first nervous inquiries. Emmett worked the land and tended the cattle, and gradually, with the patient intelligence of a man who understood animals and weather and the particular personalities of individual plots of ground, began to build the operation into something that would last. He hired on a young hand named Joseph Walker in the fall of 1879, the son of a black homesteader family that had come to Kansas under the Exodusters' migration, the great movement of freed black Americans who had been seeking better lives on the frontier after the end of Reconstruction. Joseph was 19 and strong and learned fast, and he and Emmett developed the easy working partnership of 2 people who respected each other's competence, which in the direct culture of the frontier was how friendship most often began. The question of the Exodusters was one that Pauline had thought about with considerable feeling since she had learned more of their story from Adelaide Morrow, who was a woman of strong opinions and broad reading. Thousands of black Americans had come to Kansas fleeing the violence and disenfranchisement that had been intensifying in the South since the withdrawal of federal Reconstruction troops in 1877. They came with almost nothing and built homesteads and communities under conditions of hardship that made Pauline's own adjustments seem minor. She thought it was important to know that, to hold it consciously, and she said as much to Emmett one evening, and he agreed without reservation, which was one of the additional reasons she loved him. Joseph Walker ate his midday meal at their table when he was working the homestead, which he was most days, and this was not universally approved of by every person in Caldwell. But Pauline and Emmett were in complete agreement on the point and cared not at all for opinions to the contrary. Joseph Walker had earned his place at their table and he sat there, and that was the end of it. In the autumn of 1879, a year after Emmett had found Pauline weeping in the church, they found themselves sitting on the porch steps of their homestead in the early evening, watching the last of the autumn light turn the prairie gold. The cattle were settled, and the dinner dishes were done, and the autumn air had that particular clean, cold edge that Pauline now associated not with loneliness and the coming of a difficult season, but with the deep quiet that is available only when one is genuinely at rest. 1 year, she said. 1 year, he agreed. She leaned against him and he put his arm around her and they watched the light go down together. "Are you happy?" he asked. He asked it directly, without apology, in the way he asked everything. She thought about it honestly, the way she had learned to think about things. She thought about the hard winter and the raccoons in the root cellar, and the fence that had let the cows through, and the chimney and the learning curve of absolutely everything. And she thought about the garden and the sewing work and the letters to and from Thomas in St. Louis, and the feeling of this land under her feet on a clear morning. And she thought about Emmett, who had sat beside her when she needed someone beside her, and had never in the year since stopped being exactly what he was, steady and true and present. "I am so happy it frightens me sometimes," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Don't be frightened," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." She tilted her head to look at him in the last light, and his eyes were on the horizon, but they turned to meet hers, warm and certain, and carrying the particular conviction of a man who says only what he means. "I know," she said. The letter came from Thomas in January of 1880, announcing with considerable excitement that he had been offered a position with a newspaper in Wichita and would be moving to Kansas that spring. He would be close enough to visit, he wrote, and he was looking forward to seeing for himself the life that Pauline's letters had been describing in what he called remarkable and quite possibly journalistic detail. Pauline read the letter twice and then went to find Emmett in the barn and read it to him, and he smiled in the quiet way that was his version of enthusiasm and said that it would be good to have her brother nearby. Thomas arrived in Wichita in April of 1880, and his first visit to the Thatcher homestead in May was one of the great pleasures of that year. He was exactly as Pauline had described him to Emmett, quick and bright and observant, with a journalist's eye for the telling detail and a young man's energy that expressed itself in an eagerness to help with every task on the homestead, sometimes helpfully, and sometimes with the well-meaning disaster of someone who has grown up in a city and is encountering the practical realities of frontier life for the first time. He and Emmett took to each other after the first slight formal awkwardness that is natural between a man's wife's brother and the man himself. Thomas asked Emmett questions about the cattle operation with genuine curiosity, and Emmett answered them with the patience he extended to anyone who was honestly trying to learn, and by the end of the first visit, they were easy together in a way that made Pauline glad in a deep place. It was during Thomas's first visit that Pauline told Emmett the news she had been carrying with considerable private excitement for 3 weeks. She told him on the evening after Thomas had gone back to Wichita, when they were alone in the kitchen, and the spring evening was warm enough to leave the door open to the scent of the grass and the early flowers in her garden. "I'm with child," she said simply. The stillness that came over Emmett Thatcher in that moment was not the stillness of a man who doesn't know what to feel. It was the stillness of a man who feels so much that he needs a moment to become equal to it. She watched it happen, watched the wave of feeling move through him and settle into something that was incandescent and quiet at the same time. And then he crossed the kitchen to her and took both her hands and looked at her with dark eyes that were, she was almost certain, slightly bright with tears that he would not shed but that were there. "Are you well?" he asked. "Are you feeling well?" "Perfectly well," she said, laughing a little. "Somewhat tired in the mornings, but otherwise very well." He held her hands and looked at her for a long moment, and then he said, "Thank you," which was perhaps not the conventional response, but which was so entirely him, and so entirely right, that she felt it warm her all the way through. "You are very welcome," she said, and they both laughed, and he held her there in the spring kitchen with the scent of the grass coming in through the open door. Their son was born on the 22nd of November, 1880, in the Homestead house with the assistance of the town doctor, Harvey Pennington, who made the 7-mile journey from Caldwell in a brisk autumn wind, and arrived with his bag and his unflappable competence, and earned every cent of his fee. Emmett spent the labor hours doing the most productive things he could think of doing, which amounted to ensuring that the fire was properly stoked. The doctor had everything he needed, and the water was hot, tasks he attended to with the focused efficiency of a man who needs to be useful in order to survive a situation that requires him to wait. Joseph Walker, who had been building a new fence section and stayed when it became clear the baby was coming, sat with Emmett outside in the cold with coffee and said little, which was what Emmett needed. When the baby came and the doctor came to the door and said it was a boy and both mother and child were doing well, Emmett Thatcher, who was a man of considerable reserve who kept his feelings in the deep, quiet places most of the time, sat down on the porch step and pressed his face into his hands for a moment. Joseph Walker patted him on the shoulder once and went back to the fence. Emmett collected himself and went inside to his wife. Pauline was sitting up in the bed, exhausted and pale and more beautiful than he had ever seen her, and she was holding a small bundle that made noises of considerable determination. She looked up when he came in and her eyes were soft and bright. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son. The baby had dark hair, of which there was a surprising quantity, and red, crumpled features, and Emmett looked at him with the wondering solemnity of a man encountering for the first time something that has entirely changed the dimensions of his world. "Hello," he said, very quietly to the baby. The baby turned its head toward his voice with the blind, instinctive certainty of the newborn, and Emmett felt something crack open in his chest that he had not known was there. "What shall we name him?" Pauline asked. They had talked about names but not settled on one. Emmett had said it should be her decision. She had said it should be both their decisions. They had left it pleasantly open, which turned out to have been wise. "What do you see when you look at him?" Emmett asked. She looked down at the baby in her arms, at the small, serious face and the dark hair, and the way one small fist was pressed against his cheek. "James," she said. "I see a James." "James Thatcher," Emmett said, and it sounded right and true and solid, like a thing that had always been waiting to be named. "James," she agreed. He leaned forward and kissed her forehead with a tenderness that was so complete it needed no words around it. James Thatcher grew from a newborn into an infant, and from an infant into a small, extremely mobile child with opinions about everything. He had his mother's intelligence and his father's quiet stubbornness, which in a child of that age manifested as an extremely firm set of views on which foods were acceptable and which were not. He was, according to all observers, extremely good-natured as long as these views were respected. The homestead grew around James's first years. The cattle herd expanded carefully, through 2 good breeding seasons and one that was more challenging, during which Emmett demonstrated the kind of measured management that got an operation through difficulty without losing ground. The house was enlarged in the summer of 1881, when Emmett and Joseph Walker and 2 additional hired men added 2 new rooms to the back, including a proper bedroom for the growing family, a project that took most of the summer and was discussed at considerable length by Pauline and Emmett on every detail, which was how they made most of their major decisions. Thomas Donnelly's visits from Wichita became a regular feature of their seasons, and he was by now as attached to the homestead as anyone. He doted on James with the particular enthusiasm of an uncle who can hand the child back when he becomes inconvenient, and he and Joseph Walker had developed an unlikely friendship rooted in a shared interest in politics and in arguing about them, which they did cheerfully, and at length whenever Thomas was in residence. In the spring of 1882, Pauline discovered she was expecting again, and in December of that year their second child arrived, a daughter they named Clara Eliza Thatcher, dark-haired like her brother and bearing a strong resemblance to her grandmother Constance, who came from St. Louis for the occasion, and who held her new granddaughter with an expression of uncomplicated joy that Pauline had never seen on her practical mother's face before and found tremendously moving. Constance Donnelly stayed for a month. In that month she and Emmett developed a relationship that Pauline watched with quiet amusement, a mutual respect between two fundamentally practical people who expressed affection through competence and demonstrated love by being useful. Constance reorganized the kitchen according to principles that were entirely logical and which Pauline happily adopted. Emmett fixed the shutters on the window of the room Constance was using and repaired the gate of the kitchen garden fence without being asked, and these two acts accomplished more in terms of Constance's opinion of her son-in-law than any number of fine words could have. When Constance left, she hugged Pauline for a long time on the porch and said, with the directness that was her particular form of love, "You made the right choice staying here." "I know, Mama," Pauline said. "He's a good man," Constance said. "I know that too," Pauline said and smiled. The Caldwell of 1882 and 1883 was a different town from the Caldwell of 1878. The cattle trade was shifting. The railhead at Caldwell was active and prosperous, but there were changes moving through the cattle industry that everyone in the territory could feel coming. The encroachment of barbed wire and settled farming, the gradual closing of the open range, the transformation of a landscape that had seemed permanent into something that was in fact always in motion. The great drives from Texas were becoming less frequent as the Kansas quarantine laws pushed the longhorn routes further west, and the character of the town was beginning to shift from the rough-edged wildness of the early Trailtown years toward something more domestic and settled. Emmett watched these changes with the careful attention of a man whose livelihood was tied to them. He was not one to refuse change, but he was not one to rush into it either, and he spent a good deal of that period in conversation with other cattlemen and with Silas Cross, who had left the Diamond H to run his own smaller operation, and with the more practically minded of the Caldwell merchants, mapping the landscape of what was coming and planning accordingly. What he concluded, over the course of many such conversations and many evenings thinking quietly by the fire while Pauline nursed Clara and James slept, and the wind moved around the house, was that the future of the Thatcher operation was not in volume but in quality. Not in driving thousands of head to distant railheads, but in raising a smaller, better-managed herd that serviced the local and regional market with reliable quality and earned the kind of reputation that was worth more than size. He brought this conclusion to Pauline one evening and laid it out for her with the same directness he brought to everything, and she listened carefully and asked the questions that needed asking and then told him what she thought, which was that it was the right thinking. "You're sure," he said. "I am not a cattle woman," she said, "but I understand the logic of it, and I know what you're capable of." He looked at her across the kitchen table where they were sitting, in the warm light of the lamp, with the children asleep and the night quiet around the house. He thought about October of 1878 and a woman weeping in a church and the decision to sit down beside her instead of walking away, and the degree to which everything real and true and worth having in his life had flowed from that one simple act of choosing to be present. "I am a lucky man," he said. "You are a good man," she said. which is somewhat better than luck." They smiled at each other across the table, and outside the prairie was vast and dark and cold, and inside the lamp burned warm and the children slept, and the life they had built together filled the house around them with the solid, beautiful weight of something true. In 1883, Joseph Walker married a young woman named Ida Mee Williams, who had come to the territory with her family from Kentucky. The wedding was held at the small church that the black community in the area had established north of town, and Emmett and Pauline attended, bringing James and Clara, and it was a celebration of considerable joy and considerable food and music that went until well after the children had fallen asleep in their parents' laps. Joseph and Ida Mee built a small house on the north quarter of the Thatcher land, which Emmett had offered at a fair leasing arrangement, and the two families became neighbors in the close, practical way that frontier neighbors are, sharing labor and tools and the particular small kindnesses of people who understand that the land asks more of each person than any person can give alone. By the autumn of 1884, the Thatcher homestead was something that a person coming upon it from the road could see was right. Not ostentatious, not grand, but well-kept and purposeful, with a good barn and a kitchen garden that was still producing late squash in October, and a neat corral where Emmett's cattle moved with the healthy ease of well-managed animals, and a house where light came through the windows in the evening in the warm, familiar way of a home that is genuinely lived in. Pauline sat on the porch one afternoon in early October of that year, watching James, now nearly 4, chase a chicken with the focused intensity that small children bring to fundamentally misguided endeavors, while Clara, nearly 2, sat on the porch boards beside her mother, and regarded the world with the considering expression she had been wearing since about the age of 3 months, and which appeared to be permanent. The autumn light was warm and golden on the grass, and the air smelled of wood smoke and dry leaves, and the coming cold that was still today, a few weeks away. She thought about the letter she had received that morning from Adelaide Morrow, who had written to say that the church was planning a gathering in December to mark the 5th anniversary of the congregation's expansion to its current size, and would Pauline and Emmett consider attending, and perhaps Pauline might be willing to say a few words about the Sunday school program she had established, which Betty Garrison's successor had continued and expanded. She would say yes to both, she had already decided. They would go to town, and they would see the people they loved in that community, and she would say something honest and grateful about what that church had meant to her, because it was true, and because the truth was worth saying. She heard hoofbeats on the road and looked up to see Emmett riding in from the south pasture, sitting easy in the saddle the way a man does who has spent his life on horseback and has reached the point of complete and unthinking ease. He saw her on the porch and raised a hand in greeting, and she raised one back, and he turned toward the barn to unsaddle, and she watched him go with the particular, unhurried appreciation of a woman who has learned not to take for granted the sight of the person she loves moving through the ordinary world. He came to the porch 20 minutes later with his hat off, and his sleeves rolled up, and sat down beside her on the porch steps. And James, apparently having concluded that the chicken was not worth the energy, came and climbed on his father with the total confidence of a child who has never had reason to doubt the strength that holds him. And Emmett settled the boy against his side. Without interrupting the sentence, he was already in the middle of saying to Pauline about the condition of the south pasture fence. "There is a letter from Adelaide Morrow," Pauline said, "about a church gathering in December." "We'll go," he said. "I was going to be asked to say a few words about the Sunday school." "Then you'll say them," he said. "You always say exactly the right thing." She looked at him. "You are a terrible flatterer." "I am a very poor flatterer," he agreed. "Everything I say is just true." She laughed, and Clara, from her position on the porch boards, looked up at the sound of her mother's laughter with the pleased, participatory expression of a child who may not understand the joke, but understands perfectly well that it is good. The December church gathering was held on a Saturday, and the Thatcher family made the 7-mile journey to Caldwell in the wagon with robes and heated bricks against the cold, James asking questions about everything he could see from his position between his parents, which at age 4 was an extensive range of topics. Clara slept in Pauline's arms with the deep, unbothered sleep of a toddler who has decided this is a perfectly acceptable arrangement. The church was full and warm and smelled of pine boughs and candle wax, decorated for the occasion with the particular frontier ingenuity that makes beauty from what is available. Adelaide Morrow had outdone herself, and she greeted Pauline at the door with the warm, unself-conscious embrace of a woman who has become a genuine friend rather than merely a community acquaintance. Many of the same people who had been at the social in the autumn of 1878 were there, older now, their situations evolved, their children taller. Henry Briscoe and his wife, their baby of that earlier season, now a child of 5 who ran with a pack of other children in the churchyard. Amos Hartley, who had taken on a partner at the dry goods store and was looking prosperously content. Sela's Cross, a little grayer, standing with the comfortable ease of a man in his own community. New faces, too, the people who had come to the territory in the years between, the families and the young men and the women with plans, the whole constantly replenishing human population of a frontier town that was slowly becoming something more permanent. When Reverend Morrow called on Pauline to speak, she stood at the front of the church and looked out at the faces she knew and the ones she didn't, and thought about what she wanted to say. She talked about the Sunday school, about the children she had taught in that short season, and the satisfaction of watching them take in knowledge with the honest hunger of young minds, and she talked about Betty Garrison and the current teacher, Margaret Cole, and about what it meant to build something that outlasted your own direct involvement in it. She said these things simply and without excessive embellishment, because the congregation she was speaking to were not people who needed decoration on their truths. And then she said one more thing, because she had decided on the walk from the wagon to the church door that she would say it. She said that 6 years ago, in the autumn of 1878, she had come to this church in one of the darkest nights of her life, with no clear road forward, and a weight of grief and uncertainty that had felt, in that moment, almost more than she could carry. And that someone had come and sat beside her, not to fix what was broken or to hurry her through what she was feeling, but simply to be there, and that this act of quiet presence had been, in its way, one of the most profound acts of kindness she had ever received. "I learned something that night," she said, "about what it means to be present for another person. It doesn't require words. It doesn't require answers. Sometimes the most generous thing you can offer someone who is struggling is simply your willingness to sit beside them in the dark without requiring them to be done with their darkness before they actually are." She paused and looked at Emmett, who was sitting in the third row with Clara on his knee and James wedged against his side, and who was looking at her with the steady, warm, unperformative love that was entirely his own. "I am grateful for this community," she said. "I am grateful for this church. I am grateful every day for the life I have found here, which is not the life I expected, but which is, without question, the life I was meant for." She sat down. Reverend Morrow said Amen, and the congregation said it with him, and Adelaide Morrow was wiping her eyes very discreetly with a handkerchief. After the gathering, they stood in the churchyard in the cold December night, the stars very bright and the air sharp and clean. James had discovered that the breath of cold air made visible clouds of steam and was deeply occupied with this phenomenon. Clara was awake now and regarding the stars from her position in Emmett's arms with the focused, serious attention she brought to new information. "That was well said," Emmett told Pauline. "I meant it," she said. "I know you did," he said. She took his free arm, his right arm, the one that was not holding their daughter, and held it as they stood in the churchyard in the cold, looking at the little white church with its warm lit windows. "Do you know what I think about sometimes?" she said. "Tell me," he said. "I think about how different everything would have been if you had simply backed out of that door," she said. "That evening in October, if you had seen me crying and thought, well, this is not my business, and left, how different everything would have been. He was quiet for a moment, considering. I couldn't have done it, he said finally. Why not? Because you needed someone there, he said simply, and I was there. It seemed to me that settled the question. She looked up at him in the starlight, this man who had walked into a church on a cold evening because his horse had thrown a shoe and the wind was cold, and had sat beside a stranger in her grief because it seemed to him that settled the question, and who had from that single unremarkable act of human kindness built with her a life that was full and real and deeply, completely good. I love you, she said. I love you, he said. He meant it the same way he always meant it, completely and without reservation, the way you mean things when you have stopped performing and started simply being. Clara reached out from her position in Emmett's arms and grabbed a handful of her mother's coat with the decisive grip of a toddler who has decided this is where she is going to be. And Pauline laughed and took her daughter. And James, noticing this redistribution of parental resources, immediately inserted himself against Emmett's side to maintain his own position. They walked back toward the wagon through the cold Caldwell night, their breath making those little clouds of steam that James was still pointing out with great satisfaction, the stars enormous and bright overhead, and Main Street quiet and lit by lamplight in the windows, and the whole small, real world of their life gathered around them like a warmth. They rode home under the stars, the children falling asleep against their parents with the total trust of children who have never had reason to fear the dark, and the prairie spread out around them in its immense and beautiful silence. And Emmett held the reins and Pauline sat beside him close, their shoulders touching, and they did not need to speak, because between them, as it had always been from the very beginning, the silence was enough. In the spring of 1885, they planted an apple tree at the edge of the kitchen garden. It was a small, unpromising-looking thing when they put it in the ground, a switch of a tree with barely a handful of branches, and James stood watching the operation with the skepticism of a 4-year-old who has not yet fully appreciated what patience makes possible. Will it have apples? He asked. In a few years, Emmett said, filling in the earth around the roots. How many years? Maybe 3 or 4. James considered this. That is a very long time, he said. It is, Emmett agreed. But when it grows, the apples will be worth it. He patted the earth firm around the base of the tree and stood, and James stood beside him and regarded the spindly young tree with a new, more respectful evaluation, the expression of a child beginning to understand that the best things take time. Pauline was standing in the garden doorway watching them, wiping her hands on her apron, Clara beside her holding onto the doorframe with both hands, and she felt something settle in her with a completeness that was not the absence of anything, but was instead the presence of everything that mattered. The prairie wind moved through the grass. The Kansas sky was enormous and blue and full of light. The tree stood in the turned earth, small and patient and full of future. She walked out to where her husband and her son were standing and stood beside them, and they looked at the tree together, and the afternoon lay around them like a gift, golden and mild and entirely, unreservedly good. Years later, when James was old enough to understand the story and old enough to ask for it, he would sit with his mother in the kitchen on winter evenings and ask her to tell him how it had begun. And she would tell him about the church and the October evening and the cold front moving in from the north, and the door opening and the quiet footsteps, and the man who had sat beside her without a single word until she was ready. And James would listen with the serious, concentrated attention he had inherited from his father, and when she finished he would say, in the manner of children who are still young enough to believe the world has a logic that adults have access to, but how did he know to sit there? And Pauline would think about that for a moment, honestly, the way she thought about all things. He didn't know, she would say. He just did the right thing because it was right, and because he was there, and he thought that was enough of a reason. And James would think about this with the grave, working thoughtfulness that was entirely his father's, and eventually nod as though it had settled something. And from the other room would come Emmett's voice, unhurried and low, saying that if someone did not come and help him with the wood before dark, they were all going to be very cold, and James would jump up and run, and the kitchen would fill with the sounds and warmth of an ordinary evening in a home that was real and whole and fully alive. And Pauline Donnelly Thatcher would sit for one quiet moment in the middle of it and think, with the same directness she had learned to bring to everything, that this was what it meant to be not done somewhere. This was it, exactly this, and it was everything. The apple tree grew. 3 years after they planted it, just as Emmett had promised, it bore its first small and imperfect crop of apples. And James, who was 7 and had waited with the patient tenacity that had been the most remarkable thing about him since infancy, climbed up to pick the first one and brought it to his father with the solemn air of a person delivering something of great significance. Emmett took the apple and looked at it and looked at his son and then looked at Pauline, who was standing on the porch steps with Clara beside her and a new baby, their third child, a boy they had named Robert, sleeping in her arms, and his expression was the one she had come to know as his version of complete happiness, quiet and clear and containing everything. He bit into the apple. He chewed it thoughtfully. "Well," James demanded. "Worth it," Emmett said. James looked at him with absolute seriousness for a moment, and then broke into a wide, satisfied grin that was entirely his own, and was the most joyful thing Pauline thought she had ever seen on a human face. The prairie stretched away beyond the homestead fence in every direction under the wide Kansas sky, and the wind moved through the apple tree, and Robert slept with the trusting heaviness of the newly arrived, and Clara picked up a fallen apple from the grass and regarded it with her characteristic considering expression, and Emmett looked at Pauline, and Pauline looked at Emmett, and between them was everything they had built together from a single act of quiet grace. From one man sitting down beside one woman in the silence of an autumn church and asking nothing of her but the time to be ready, it was enough. It had always been enough. It was more than enough. It was the whole world.